Number 5. Make Mine Music. I don't really have a whole lot to say about this one because the main issue I have with it is that it's just incredibly boring and forgettable. So forgettable that even Disney themselves seem to have forgotten about it. This one was actually quite difficult to find compared to everything else in the animated canon. One may ask why this one versus any of the other mediocre Disney movies that could be described as boring and forgettable, and it's because of just how little there is to vouch for in this movie. Even for some of the movies I wound up ranking above it on this list, there were some parts where I could say, well, at least that part was good. In fact, I very nearly put my number 4 entry at this spot instead for that exact reason. Most of the music was pretty dated, and for the only two segments that I found somewhat memorable, the reasons I found them memorable were that The Martins and the Coys has quite possibly the dumbest storyline of all time, and in Casey at the Bat there was something about the way the characters moved that made me feel really uncomfortable. The only thing that you can kind of vouch for is the animation, and even that is probably some of the blandest 2D animation that Disney has ever produced. Number 4, Meet the Robinsons. It seems that a lot of people consider this one to be an underrated classic, and honestly, I do wish I could agree. There's actually a lot of really cool foreshadowing in the first half. Seeing the older versions of characters we'd had brief glimpses of before, Wilbur warning Lewis that he should probably hide his most distinct feature if he doesn't want people to know he's from the past, the frogs, the way the unnamed villain talks to Goob, and it's all delivered somewhat subtly and actually gives the viewer a chance to figure it out for themselves before spelling it out to them. Some of it was a little too obvious, but overall that part was pretty great. Unfortunately, it's surrounded by the most annoying humor that you can possibly imagine. Whoever wrote it seems to believe that random plus loud equals funny. It doesn't. And that's not the only issue either. The main character is pretty annoying, and the time travel logic really falls apart in the second half. Many consider this to be invalid criticism because time travel is inherently a pretty illogical concept, a belief that I do understand to some degree, but I think it's particularly bad here because it actually completely undoes the arc of one of the major characters. Instead of having him learn from his conflict, the way it gets resolved is the main character just makes it so his conflict never happened to begin with, which actually pretty much directly contradicts the message that the movie was going for. Number 3, Ralph Breaks the Internet. I hardly even know what to say about this one. There's no through line, there's not even really a plot for a majority of the movie. They just give the characters the vague goal of get thing, and then most of the runtime is just memes and internet trends that were dead several years before this movie was even announced, combined with some of the most played out humor ever. Almost every single joke in this movie, both related and unrelated to the internet angle, I've seen a million different times in a million different places. There was even an elongated, unfunny sketch that was recycled from the first Wreck-It Ralph movie practically verbatim. Over an hour of this, and then in the last 20 minutes, they realized that to have a movie, they needed some kind of conflict and ending, so they just threw in something about Ralph being too clingy. I am able to think of a few minor things that I liked. There were some decent visual gags in the backgrounds of some shots. There was one joke that was set up pretty early on that actually had a pretty funny payoff, and however forced in that Vanellope's leaving conflict was, at least it was one of the only characters leaving conflicts I've seen where they actually commit to it. But they're scarce, and hidden amongst an hour and a half of bullshit. Number 2, Home on the Range. I'll start with a few positives. This probably has the best animation and character design out of anything on this list. Looking at that alone, this almost looks like it could be something half decent. When the fat one wasn't belching for no reason, the main trio were tolerable, even alright in a few scenes. And that's pretty much it. I think this was Disney's attempt to be like DreamWorks, or at least incorporate the edge factor that DreamWorks has in their movies. Nowhere else in the animated canon did I see things like the opening line of the movie being the main character making a tit-sized joke about herself. Most of the humor is just annoying. I loosely mentioned it already, but it bears repeating. I actually cannot believe how many times a character belches for no reason in this movie, and this horse character, he alone doubles the annoying factor. And when the humor isn't annoying, it's just confusing. For example, The villain is this guy who runs farmers out of business by stealing their cows, and he does so by using a hypnotic yodel. And in pretty much every scenario involving this, the main characters rely on the fact that this yellow cow isn't affected by it. Her explanation for why she isn't affected is because she has perfect pitch, even though she's a terrible singer. And they don't explain it any further than that. Like, is that supposed to be funny? I don't get it. However, as stupid and terrible as this is, I actually almost kind of recommend this one. I did get a few decent laughs out of this movie, even if they were more out of bewilderment than anything else. And now for the dishonorable mentions. The Black Cauldron. It seems that this was kind of a failed experiment. In a similar way to Home on the Range, only the influence came from Ralph Bakshi instead of DreamWorks. With this one, they tried some different animation techniques and also tried to be a bit edgier, but they didn't do either very well. I distinctly remember several points where you could see some very obvious white outlines around characters, and I can't say I was a fan of the very Ralph Bakshi way women were drawn. And it's not like the movie was good outside of these issues. I couldn't tell you the name of a single character, the story is riddled with annoying cliches, and the characters really don't face a single challenge in defeating the villain. However, it was less boring than Make Mine Music and less irritating than all the others. You can consider this one number 6. Dinosaur. A technical achievement that I'm sure was a lot more impressive when it came out, but is really dated at this point, and doesn't really have a whole lot else to offer. But I actually didn't find this one nearly as bad as I thought I would. From what I'd heard about it, I was expecting a really annoying comedy, and while there are definitely moments like that, overall, it actually took itself pretty seriously. It's nothing special, but it's not the worst. Oliver and Company and Brother Bear. These two movies each have one really big issue. Oliver and Company has possibly the most inconsistent characters in film history, and Brother Bear seemed to be unable to insert its humor naturally into the flow of the movie, instead completely stopping the plot, sometimes for several minutes at a time, to insert an unfunny comedy bit that has little to do with anything. However big those problems are, though, they alone aren't enough to put those movies on this list, and they're both fine besides that. Plus, they both actually have pretty great soundtracks. Also, there are a few movies that I just want to say were massively boring, but didn't really have any aspects that I could say were straight up bad, other than, being boring. And now on to number 1, which coincidentally was the very next animated Canon movie to be released after my number 2 entry. Number 1, Chicken Little. This was easily my most joyless experience watching through the animated Canon. Make Mine Music at least had decent animation. Meet the Robinsons at least had some interesting ideas. Ralph Breaks the Internet at least had a few jokes that landed. Home on the Range was at least kind of funny bad because of how bizarre it was. This movie doesn't have anything like that going for it. It's bad in the most boring way possible. For one, it looks like complete shit. The character designs are ugly and unappealing and have no ability to express. Most of them are making pretty much the exact same face for the entire movie, and they are reused so often. It's very visually boring in addition to being visually ugly, too. It's flat and has no style. So, come to think of it, it looks like a studio's early to mid-2000s first attempt at a fully CG animated movie. What's being conveyed with this animation isn't really any better. One Disney trope that I started to get a little bit tired of was them constantly using the beginning of the movie to really hammer in that the main character was an outcast that no one likes. This movie, no exaggeration, spends half the runtime doing pretty much nothing but that. Yeah, it is framed by an incredibly generic sports plot, but nothing about the sports plot affects any character or the outcome of the movie whatsoever, so that's really the only purpose that the entire first half of the movie serves. The second half, I would say, is kind of like E.T. if E.T.'s parents were hostile, except that makes it sound a lot more interesting than it actually is. Honestly, I don't even really remember what fills the runtime in the second half. Everyone's just running in circles while aliens are attacking, and the main character is trying to show them that the alien kid is alright, and somehow that goes on for another 40 minutes. As for the humor, it's not the most annoying or the most bizarre, it's the most nothing. In the entire runtime, the only jokes that got any response out of me were the dad character making self-aware quips about how he's a terrible, neglectful parent, which I guess is somehow supposed to be funny. For those reasons, Chicken Little is my choice for the worst movie in the Disney animated canon.